I've started recording. Animesh, please go ahead.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for getting this off the ground. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Just so that you see who is speaking, right, I will enable my video. So hello, everyone, and I will go off the video just for the purposes of conserving bandwidth. So welcome to Kubeflow Dojo. Today's the day is divided, or the dojo essentially is divided into two parts, right? First day, we focus on some of the basics initially, and then start going wider onto Kubeflow, covering the whole breadth of Kubeflow, and then getting the development environment set up, talking through the Kubeflow control plane, having a workshop where you can deploy Kubeflow on either your Kubernetes cluster if you have it, or on a Minikube. And in addition, we have some IBM Cloud Kubernetes clusters available as well for those who need it. The other part of it is that tomorrow is where we will be doing deep dive into other areas of Kubeflow. For example, a lot of the audience typically, does a lot with Kubeflow pipeline. So there will be a deeper dive into that, followed by a hands-on workshop on Kubeflow pipelines, KF serving, which is the model serving, and then distributed training and hyperparameter optimization pieces, followed by a hands-on where we walk you through ideally getting your first PR created, if that's one of the goals which we're looking at it from your perspective. So I think for most of the people who are here, I believe at the outset you all know what Kubeflow is. So that's not how I would want to start, right? We will probably take I just wanted to start from the notion of what we are doing in IBM and why is open source important for us, and why in general responsible AI is important for us. And the second aspect of it is that how do the two feed each other? Now, one of the things which we are all aware of at this particular point in time, that we are living in an unprecedented time in history, right? There is a global health crisis going on. And then, within the US and the worldwide, right, we have a movement where the country as such is soul searching. And that's going across the board. Even within IBM, right, we are going back and looking at our core values as, the principles on which the company was founded and the principles on which it's being driven. And that's across the board, across US. These two unprecedented events have, spiraled a lot of conversations. Now, IBM in general has a history for tech for social good. More than 4,000 IBMers, for example, worked very closely with NASA in the first moon landing project. We have been contributing heavily to genome sequencing, responding to infectious diseases. Of late, IBM has an initiative going on with United Nations and World Health Organization around tracking the responses to COVID-19 and launching a call for code challenge to get developers participate and create solutions which can help alleviate, mitigate, or provide solutions around this crisis. Definitely another focus as part of that call for code has been climate change. This year, in the past, we tackled disaster response. So there is, this is part of the IBM's DNA. And it matters more so in these unprecedented times, right? I mean, if you look for and Google for simple, responsible AI in the current times, you will see, multiple articles coming in because of the current crisis we are going in, why it becomes all the more relevant, right? Why do we need responsible AI? Why do we need trusted AI? Now, one of the actions which our CEO, Arvind Krishna, recently took is that, there was a letter which was sent to US Congress where IBM discontinued its facial or visual recognition service around, facial recognition, but also, calling for overall, the points which we want you to make so as to bring equality into this particular spectrum. Now, in addition for Check for Social Good, IBM also has a history of open source. We have been working with multiple open source projects. We have been working with foundations. In fact, pretty early, starting from the days of Linux, that was where IBM became very active in the open source side. That was followed by Eclipse, where IBM donated the whole set of initial code, which is now the basis of Eclipse, and then at that time was donated to Eclipse Foundation, and that foundation was formed. And we've carried that forward with more recently with Cloud Native Computing Foundation, where we worked very closely with all the stakeholders to for example, get Kubernetes into that open source foundation. And recently, we have been doing a lot of work with Linux Foundation AI. IBM joined Linux Foundation AI last year, and one of part of the big reason was the advancement of trusted AI. So we would say the history of IBM, but it's also very, very relevant in the current context of the group I am in, right? So bit about myself. One of the architects in a group in IBM called CODE, which stands for Center for Open Source Data and AI Technologies. We work on open source projects across the end-to-end data and AI lifecycle, data asset exchange, um, Spark, where we contribute heavily. Last few years, there have been, IBM has been the second largest contributor to Spark. We contribute heavily to the Jupyter ecosystem. Very recently, we launched a project in that space called Elira. Then currently there is a lot of contributions from IBM going to TensorFlow, our trusted AI libraries as well. And then obviously Kubeflow, which covers a large part of this life cycle. And as we have the follow-on end-to-end talk on Kubeflow, I will go through some of the IBM contributions and the overall, the amount of interaction IBM is having in that community on that particular side. So this is our group. My day job, I lead IBM's engagement in the Kubeflow community. I'm a committer there. I also lead a lot of the efforts around our data and AI open source alignment efforts, working with OpenShift and Red Hat teams. I'm also one of the co-chairs in the Linux Foundation AI and Trusted AI. And then I also run the MLOps SIG and CD Foundation, which is specifically focused on the MLOps aspects as it ties to the pipelines technology. Now, when we talk about Center for Open Source Data and AI Technologies, we have approximately 40 plus full-time open source developers. Now, those numbers keep on changing. But typically, a large part of the team is concentrated across the two venues in Bay Area. One is Watson West, which is in San Francisco, what we call the north part of the Bay. And then we have IBM Silicon Valley Lab, which is the South Bay. So we do have developers spread across these two labs, but in general, we have developers across US as well as across the globe. Now, this is an analysis which one of my colleagues, Fred Rice, who is the chief architect of CODE, who compiled, right? When we look at something like, okay, 40 plus full-time open source developers in data and AI, that looks like a lot of open source developers. Or is it? Right. Now, when you look at it in the context of the overall IBM, right? When this was compiled, right? Just the last month, more than 1,000 IBMers at a minimum were actively contributing code in open source. So now when you put it in perspective with what we are doing within our group, we start looking very small. Now you take it to the next level. You're all aware that Red Hat joined IBM family, and if you look at it in perspective and put all the Red Hat developers, because Red Hat primarily the primary mode of development in Red Hat is contributing to open source and consuming open source. You start looking at this particular pie graph. The contributions from our perspective start looking even smaller. So I think this is to underline the fact that IBM has been doing a lot in the open source historically, starting from the days of Linux. And even currently, when you look at the current distribution of the company, there are multiple IBM developers, and now with the Red Hat family joining in, who are actively contributing to open source on a day-to-day basis. Right. And I was talking about trusted AI. One of the things which we have been focusing on also and advancing the message is that, AI should be built responsibly, should be trusted, should be ethical. And the best way also to do it is, put the code around these technologies in open source. So that's one of the activities which we did previously, where we moved our projects around bias detection and mitigation, adversarial detection of images, or explaining AI model predictions, all in open source. And very recently, we also donated these projects to Linux Foundation AI. So they are now part of the Linux Foundation AI in open governance, carrying forward our history of contributing to open source, creating communities through open governance in a neutral place. But when we look at the overall data and AI lifecycle, definitely it's much bigger, right? It's starting from the data cleansing, data ingestion, data analysis, and transformation, which is a big part of the data lifecycle, which is where a lot of the data scientists spend their time. And after that, the model lifecycle begins, which is essentially starts from creating a model, doing distributed training, doing hyperparameter optimization. Once you have your candidate models based on the different hyperparameters you have run, you want to validate them. Once you have validated, then you are training, validating again, deploying. But the key part and the difference from a typical, application development world is that model development and deployment is very, very iterative, right? It's not always a 2 + 2 = 4 equation. You can have the same model with the same inputs, giving you different predictions 2 weeks later, right? Nothing has changed. Your inputs haven't changed. The model hasn't technically changed, but since it has been learning over the data set, it has been consuming for the predictions, right? It will probably give a different, or it might give a different result 2 weeks later. So that's where, you have new data sets coming in. The models are found to have drift. There is, anomalies, or, the models are giving biased results. For a lot of various reasons, you will need to go back and go through this life cycle, right? And that's where, having projects in this space which can help automate, help solve parts of the life cycle becomes so much relevant. Now, the life cycle is big, but when you look at the landscape of open source projects in the data and AI space, that has become even bigger, right? So this is the landscape diagram from Linux Foundation AI, where they essentially go through the different phases of AI lifecycle, scan the open source projects, and if they're found to be relevant, they actually list it here. Now, if this is the view which tells you that open source has completely taken over data and AI, I mean, you wouldn't be mistaken, right? Almost for every lifecycle piece, for particular niches, like for example, if you're looking at more advanced things like reinforcement learning, etc., there are multiple projects springing up, right? So this landscape is exploding. And one of the great things, the way LFAI is also, putting this here is the bigger cards which you see are the projects which are in Linux Foundation AI, which have moved in an open governance process so that, the risks of a single vendor dominating those projects is mitigated. There are no licensing or IP concerns, so you can, be very free to start using them. But definitely, I will just very quickly give you the link also. So if you guys want to, go through this landscape and understand, as I was talking, right, there is also the card which you see on the bottom left corner around trusted and responsible AI, where a lot of the projects which we donated are listed as well. Another key project in LFAI where a lot of the member companies are collaborating and working together is Onyx, which was initiated by Facebook, Microsoft, AWS, and now IBM is a major contributor there. Plus, a lot of other companies are collaborating as well. And that brings me to Kubeflow, right? Obviously, the breadth is huge. The life cycle requires a lot of efforts and a lot of automation. And Kubeflow attempts to solve that problem on the model lifecycle part of it, right? So when we mention end-to-end, definitely, there is one area where Kubeflow is not heavily focused on, though there are projects in that space, which is, the data lifecycle. So for example, doing your ETL jobs, etc. They appear in the surrounding projects and the integrated projects in Kubeflow, but that's not the primary focus. The primary focus is on the machine learning lifecycle, right? So what we call build, train, deploy, and manage. And that's where, the projects around that ecosystem are getting integrated, right? So specifically, when you look at build, using Jupyter notebooks, there are different training operators to allow you to do distributed training. If you're using hyperparameter optimization as part of the distributed training, there are projects for that. If you're deploying your models in production, either in serverless fashion using KF serving or in a dedicated fashion using Seldon, those are all well integrated. And there are a lot of monitoring and tracing tools which are also well integrated. So even if you look at it from a data scientist perspective, something like TensorBoard, or when you're looking at more from a MLOps, DevOps perspective, things like Prometheus, Grafana, etc. So that is where we will be focused on for the next 2 days. And I will go much deeper into the Kubeflow umbrella, the breadth of the projects in the session after this. So with that, welcome everyone to Kubeflow Dojo, right? Please go to this GitHub repository if you haven't already done, github.com/IBM/Kubeflow Dojo. My Twitter and GitHub handles are listed there, as well as my email if you do need to reach out for any questions or comments, and I will be back. I think the session after this, we will be doing more basics and go back to the basics, where Morgan, who is an excellent, I would say, whenever Morgan has a session within IBM, right, I get so many compliments. So he's an excellent speaker, and he will be walking through the basics of Git and GitHub setup, right? I think over the course of some of these training sessions, we have realized, quite a few people do come and they want to do, but they don't have, some of the basics which are needed to get started with Git and GitHub. So that's why, that particular session is here. If you already are very proficient, I would encourage you to join at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, translating to your time zone, where, I will be going for an hour or so walkthrough of Kubeflow end-to-end ML on Kubernetes. With that, I will transfer to you, Morgan.
Can you just hang on a minute, Animesh? I'd like to point out that the slides and videos are already available for most of the sessions. And so people are asking, and so you can just go and you can see them on the agenda there. And that's at the link I just pasted in the chat. Could you all make sure you join the Slack if you're interested in keeping in touch? And then finally, someone said that the meeting invite had an email. So I'll just talk to you separately, Mega, about your question. Anyway, would you like to also briefly, Animesh, just tell us when the first break is going to be, just so that people can plan their coffee and so on?
Yeah, I think, we will, try to abide very, very closely with the time, right? There will be 5 minutes here or there, I'm hoping. But after Morgan is done walking through, getting Git and GitHub set up for the participants who are interested in it, and then, we have the session, which is essentially going across the Kubeflow, going through different components, followed by some demos. That's when, we take a break. So translates.
So it's about 1 hour and 3/4 or 1 hour and a half, 90 minutes from now is our first break, something like that.
You are good at your calculations, Susan. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Any other questions from anyone? No. Okay.